Um, Mrs. Page, tell me what happened when the Germans arrived at your door to arrest your mother. Describe to me that incident and what happened.
I was in our apartment alone at the time. My mother went downstairs to attend to someone who was sick in the building. You know, my mother was a physician. And there was a tremendous knock on the door, and I went to open. This was very early stages of the war, so we were not used to it yet. This was November 1939, early November, and I opened the door and I saw one German, whatever he was, some kind of a officer, and three men dressed in black uniforms of the local Germans who were, of course, the traitors to Poland and collaborated and before the war and with and collaborated during the war with the occupiers. And they came and the men said that where is my mother? In the meantime, my mother ran up the steps and came to the apartment, and they said that she's arrested on political grounds. And they said to take just a few warm things and put all the valuables, money, jewelry on the table. And we didn't know. I was not on the list. So my mother told me, why don't you go to your boyfriend? I said, I don't want to go to my boyfriend. I want to go with you, you know. And she told me to put the valuables on the table. No, she did it. And then we went to the bedroom to collect, our warm things, just a few things they let us have. And she said to me in Russian, my mother was Russian originally. She said to me, throw this, she had it in a little sack, throw it in the toilet and flush the water. And I, as an obedient daughter, did that, you know. And they closed the apartment, they sealed it, and they took us to a place which was actually my high school. And there I thought that we were only arrested because deportations were not with it. They were not, we didn't know about deportations yet. This was just November, you know, and we realized that there were maybe, later we found out, about 1,000 people, both Polish Catholics and Jews from Poland. I would say that this was the intelligentsia of the city. The Germans tried to quell any kind of resistance, and they did the same thing in all the cities. The very beginning, they tried to get rid of the people who would provide, who would resist or something like that. And they put us in trains. At that time, there was passenger trains. They were now cattle trains yet. And they took part of us to the city of, part of the transport to the city of Częstochowa. And the other part, which my mother and I were in it, to Kraków, the city of Kraków.
Okay, let's stop for just a second. Okay, Mrs. Page, I want you to tell me that same story again, but as though you haven't told it to me before. So that's how the Germans arrived at your door to arrest your mother.
Mm-hmm. It was November, I think 11, 1939, early evening, and I was alone in the apartment. My mother had to go downstairs to attend to some patient in our apartment house, and I heard a knock or a ring, the bell rang, I don't remember exactly. I went to open the door, and there were three Germans altogether. One was in a green uniform. I assume it was SS. In those days, I didn't distinguish it so clearly, you know. He was older, and two younger men dressed in the dark uniforms of the local Germans who were now within the German army and who before collaborated with the Germans and basically were traitors before the war. And one of them said that my mother in the meantime came upstairs, running up because someone probably let her know that the Germans are knocking on the door. And they told her that she's arrested on political grounds. And I was not on the list. They said I can go. But my mother told me to go and see to my boyfriend's house. First of all, I couldn't have gone anyway because there was a curfew. I couldn't move, from the house, but I wouldn't go anyway. I told her I want to stay with her. And they told us to take a few warm things, put all the valuables and jewelry on the table. And as we were getting ready, my mother in those days, being aware of the Germans and trying to be ready just in case, had her jewelry in the tiny little sack. And she told me, take this and throw it in the toilet and flush the water. And I did it. Then we went out, they sealed the apartment, and they took us to a building which was my pre-war high school, which I graduated from. In the big gym, in the big room, I realized that there were many, many people. Later, we found out it was about 1,000, both Polish Catholics and Polish Jews. It was like an elite of the city. I realized that too over there, which we understood later that probably the Germans wanted to get rid of all the sources of resistance at first, the leaders. They did it in every city or every town that they were in. This was the procedure they went by. And then they put us on the trains, passenger trains at the time, because it was early days of the war. And they took us, part of the transport went to the city of Częstochowa, which is famous for its Black Madonna. And our part of the transport went to the city of Kraków. We were put in an old Polish fortress in the city of Kraków from medieval times, I think. And we were put on straw, not even mattresses, just straw. And we were received by the Jewish community representatives, and the Polish Catholics were received by the Red Cross. And of course, we had no money. We had just the basic necessities. We were uprooted. We were in terrible despair. We didn't know what deportation meant at the time because this was without precedent. This was the very first in our city, and I think in whole occupied Poland, one of the very first ones.
Describe the difference between the ghetto in Krakow and the ghetto in Warsaw.
Well, I know. We were in the ghetto of Krakow. By that time, I was already married. And the ghetto of Krakow, comparing to ghetto of Warsaw, was not as terrible. When my mother could not stay she stayed with us in Krakow during the pre-ghetto days, when ghetto was established, or even before that. People who came after September 1939 to Krakow, who were not before that then, had to leave the city. And they could choose any city or town within the general government, which was not the Deutsches Reich, the German Reich proper. So she chose to go to Warsaw. And for maybe twice, I went to visit her with a special permission. In those days, you had to get a special permission to be able to, and I traveled by train. And even then, before the ghetto was not closed in Warsaw. I was not there when the ghetto was closed. I was there before it was closed, but all the Jews lived within a certain district, and it was just terrifying. People were already hungry. People were in rags. There was such a sense of despair over there. My mother was still practicing medicine over there, all alone. We tried to bring her to Krakow to us, but it was absolutely impossible. In Krakow, on the other hand, we were all working for the German war effort, of course, you know. There were deportations, but it was not as terribly gloomy. And first of all, we were not that hungry. Somehow everybody managed to eat in those days of the ghetto. In Warsaw, hunger was there from the beginning, even before the ghetto was closed.
Okay, we have to reload.
Okay.
So, but don't worry about that. You don't have to fill in the chronological details. Now I'm just going to ask you, who was Oskar Schindler and what did he do? Describe him too.
Okay. Oskar Schindler was a German industrialist who came to the occupied city of Krakow in the early days, I think already maybe September 1939, I don't know exactly, maybe October. He, like many Germans, he was not a military man. He belonged to the Nazi party, but he was an industrialist who lived, he was from Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, you know, which was the German, with the German population of Czechoslovakia. You see, he came to Krakow, I think, looking for possibilities to do business. This was occupied territory and so on. Anyway, he took over because each Jewish business had to have some kind of a German, like an overseer, I don't know the exact term for that. So he took over a Jewish enamel factory which produced pots and pans at the beginning. And he started to employ, first of all, Poles, and then I think he got acquainted with the bookkeeper, who was the main bookkeeper of that factory, and he kind of liked him. And I think that bookkeeper and maybe Mr. Schindler himself realized that it would be very good to employ some Jewish labor, and he did so. He was a very, very warm man, and from the beginning, the Jews who worked for him worshipped him, you know, because he was kind. There was such a contrast to everybody else. There was, in the whole history of war, I didn't know anyone like him. I didn't work for him at that time, but those Jews who did, excuse me, had this opinion of him. My mother-in-law was an interior decorator. And this is, I'm talking about pre-ghetto days. And one day he came over to her apartment, recommended by one of some other Jewish acquaintances of hers, that he had a new apartment. He moved into an apartment, and he would like her to decorate it for him. You know, in Poland before the war, you didn't buy ready-made things. Everything was made to order, like drapes and tablecloths and everything. And this gave my husband's family, his parents, his sister, and myself, you know, I was married to him in February of 1940, means of survival, because, you know, he paid for all the services, for everything, and besides was very, very kind. Would you like me to tell you what happened?
Describe him to me. What did he look like?
Physically?
Yeah.
He was a very tall man, a little, I would say, kind of broad-shouldered, very blonde, very blue-eyed, and had this air of such goodness emanating from him. I remember later on when we were in the camp, which he established in Sudeten at the very end of the war, we were always freezing when we saw a German, because it meant that either there will be shooting, or there will be beating, or there will be some other kind of torture, moral or physical. But when he came, all we could see was Herr Director. We used to call him Herr Director, and he smelled awfully good, and he was always dressed beautifully, and always dropping cigarettes all over. He was smoking a cigarette and then put butts around so the people could pick it up and smoke it, because of course they didn't have any cigarettes. People loved to work for him. Later on, after this original period of time in Krakow, in that factory, when the ghetto was established, he decided to have his people, his workers, live on the premises. He had his camp, his own little factory, and on the premises the workers were living. They worked very hard because, to work with enamel ware, I understand they had to carry these heavy enamel pots, and there was a night shift and the day shift, but they were fed. Even though it was not easy to feed people in those days, they were fed. They were never harassed, because the Germans who guarded the camp were not allowed to do things which they didn't ask for permission to do in regular camps, because Director Schindler was bribing them, giving them presents and so on. They were always treated humanely. So it was such a privilege to work for him. That was like a gift from God in those days, to be able to work for Oskar Schindler, in comparison to have to work in camps like we did in Plasźow.
What was Schindler's List, and how big was it?
At the end of the war, 1944, around October, we realized that the camp in Plasźow will be liquidated because the Russians were approaching and the Germans were retreating. So they were liquidating all the camps around. But Schindler wanted to protect his people. He decided, he went on kind of a fact-finding trip to Sudetenland, which was his home, to a small, it wasn't even a town, it was a village almost, called Brünnlitz. In Czech, in German was Brünnlitz. And there he acquired 2 factories.
We have to stop for the helicopter, I think. Okay, so now tell me how Schindler was going to try to rescue more people toward the end.
First of all, he put on the list, this was how actually not Schindler, but the administration of the camp Plasźow, to which his factory and the adjoining quarters, belonged to. They belonged to the camp Plasźow. So the administration of the camp Plasźow started preparing the list. The list consisted mainly of his workers which were employed at his enamel fabric. It was called Emalia. Then also there was another businessman in the camp of Plasźow called Julius Madrich, for whom I worked at the time. He was also very good to his workers, not like Schindler by no means. And when the end of the war and the Russians started to approach and the Germans wanted to liquidate the camps and retreat, Schindler, they were very good friends, Schindler and Madrich, and Schindler approached Madrich to do the same thing, to join forces and relocate all the workers to the 2 factories in Sudetenland. But Madrid refused. He said, I did everything for my Jews, whatever was possible, but now that's the end. I cannot do anything else. So Schindler went alone. But from the list of Madrid workers, he picked up also a number of Madrid workers. It was a very difficult process because everybody wanted to get on that list. And this way, I think it was about 1,300 people that he was able to relocate to Sudeten.
What did the list represent? If you were on the list, were you safe?
Well, there was no safety under German occupation. There was no safety because these people they were torturers, murderers. There was no logic in it, no reason in it. This was just pure hatred and pure murder all the time. But Schindler assumed that if his workers will work for the war effort, and he changed it in Brünnlitz, he changed his production to production of shells from enamelware, because he had to prove really, because they arrested him twice because they didn't think that he was working for the war effort, and so on. So we were making shells, and we were supposed to polish these shells, but all the production was faulty because we on purpose were sabotaging this, they were never as they ought to be, always was something flawed in those shells during our months in Brünnlitz. And this is how he could save us, proving that his factory was indispensable for the war effort. He had connections always. He knew how to, he was always very well liked by Germans as well. He always used to give them presents and do favors for them. So,
You have to reload.
Okay.
I want you to talk to me a little bit more about the sabotage. Was Schindler involved himself in the
Oh, he knew about it, of course. He knew that the production was faulty, and he was absolutely involved in everything.
Was he the mastermind? Tell me whether it was...
I tell you the truth, I really don't know that much about it. I think that my husband would be able to give you more details on that, because he himself was more involved in that than I was. I was just, polishing my shells, but we knew that there was sabotage going, and this was about 6 months before the war, before the end of the war, when we arrived there in Brünnlitz, and that's how it turned out to be.
Okay. Cut for the plane for a minute.
Going out from Plasźow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
In sometime the beginning of November, my husband and I found out that we were on the list. The men, we were very happy. We didn't know what will await us, but we knew that we're going to go to something better than anything that we could conceive at the time. The men left a week before the women did. And later we found out that they did not go directly to Brünnlitz. They went through Grossrosen, which they stayed there, I think, a few days, and this was a very, very difficult camp, but they finally arrived in Brünnlitz. The women, on the other hand, we left a week later, and we were in the cattle trains, of course, packed like sardines, and we were going. We didn't know where we were going. We assumed we're going to go to Brünnlitz directly. All of a sudden, we landed at this very famous now platform, train platform at station in Auschwitz, with SS running like mad people, with dogs barking all over, and they started to push us out of trains and run us to a selection process, which was by itself terrible. We had to undress completely. I clutched, in those days I already wore glasses, and I clutched them in my hand because I knew if I don't have glasses, I won't be able to do any work. I won't be able to see very well. So I clutched, and thank God no one ever discovered. Some women had their heads shaven. I didn't, just cut short. So I don't know how they did it. I probably, just picked certain people. Then, and of course the Germans were laughing and making, dirty jokes, and it was just terrible. We were completely not prepared for this because we thought we were going to Mr. Schindler, to his camp. Then they took us to the so-called sauna through a getting rid of lice, the delousing process. We had to put all our clothes and our bundles, everything, in one room, get undressed, go through the showers, then go to get our clothes. And the clothes were on the heap, and each one of us picked whatever we could. I remember I got some kind of a white shirt, some rag, which was probably from somebody dead already, and some kind of a dress, no underwear, and of course no shoes. I had to take the clogs, the wooden clogs. Then we were led, this was Birkenau, we were led to the barracks. We arrived there, everybody in despair, but at the moment when we were picking our clothes and we put them on, how strong human nature is in spite of everything you go through, or maybe this was youth, we were young at the time, we started to laugh hysterically in that room where we were putting on those clothes, because we couldn't see ourselves because of course there were no mirrors, but we looked so ridiculous that we started to laugh hysterically. And I forgot to say that before that, in the sauna, of course there was no hot water, forget that, but there was no soap of any kind, just freezing water. November in Poland is very, very cold. And so there were no toilet paper, no paper at all in the latrines. Then after we got dressed, they took us to the barracks in Birkenau. The mud in Birkenau at the time, and probably in Auschwitz maybe not so, because the roads, the streets in Auschwitz, within Auschwitz, were paved more or less. But in Birkenau you walked and the clogs stayed in the mud and you kept on walking, it was just terrible. We arrived, and in Plasźow we slept like two to a bunk. There I think we were 10 or 11 or 13, we were sleeping like sardines. No, they give us some kind of a old dirty comforter. And all of a sudden, in that barrack, somebody called my name. This was my friend. She was on the upper bunk. She came with a transport before us, a couple of months before us. And she was working for a German office, in the office anyway. And she gave me a piece of bread with honey at the time. I will never forget it because I never got it again. We didn't know anything about what happened to our men. We assumed the same fate happened to them in some other camp. And we were waiting. I think that all of us would have died even before being gassed, because we were all terribly sick with dysentery. We were terribly hungry. And we couldn't, the terrible food that they gave, some very watery soup with a few beets inside, and a tiny piece of bread every day, which also caused our dysentery. This was this kind of bread. We were all sick. So I don't think if Oskar Schindler, after 3 weeks, through his trying to get us out, through his connections and presence that he gave all around and everything, I don't think we would have survived. So finally, after about 3 weeks, I think we lost the count of time over there. They told us, someone came, probably a Blockel tester, or some German, I don't remember exactly, and started to call our names. Well, that was already good, because we knew we are the 300 woman, and she called us by name. We didn't know what she wants us for, but they led us to a side a train station, like on the sideline, and they put us in the trains again, packed like sardines. Of course, no toilets. There was a pail in the middle. No food. We didn't get any food. I don't know if some of us had a little piece of bread from Birkenau yet. And after a while, the train started to go. We were only guessing. We didn't know where we're going, because first of all, there are no windows in the cattle cars. We stopped, I think, on the way. The German soldiers let us go out for a while, and we had some snow that we took from the ground and kind of instead of a drink. And finally we arrived in some very desolate station, and it said Brünnlitz. It said Brünnlitz, so of course we were terribly excited that finally we arrived at our destination. But in the background we saw some very tall chimneys, and as we marched to Schindler's camp, which we assumed would be Schindler's camp, we marched by fives, and I was walking among other friends with a girl who came originally from Germany, but she was deported from Germany to Poland, and in Poland to camp in Plasźow, and with us to Birkenau and to Schindler's camp. Her name was Margot. And she said to me, "Oh my God, now we're going to die. Do you see these chimneys?" And I said, I always get upset. And I said to her, "Margot, we cannot die, because if we would be destined to die, we would die in Birkenau." I was always an optimist. And finally, we were...
All 4 is up. So you take 6 is up.
Okay, Mrs. Page, can you just back up to where Margot said, "Oh no," we saw the chimneys.
We saw the chimneys, and Margot said, "Look at the chimneys. Now I'm sure they're going to kill us. Look at them." And I said to her, "Margot, I'm positive they won't do it, because if they wanted to kill us, why transport us to Brünnlitz, bring us here, and I'm sure they won't do it." And we kept on marching until we arrived at the destination, which was Schindler's factory. It was kind of we saw a building, which was a 2-story building. The lower floor, and then the upper was all, had balconies all through the width of the building. And the door was open, the gates rather were open, and we marched in. And as we marched in, I saw men in the striped suits which they didn't wear in Plasźow, because in Plasźow one still could wear their own clothes, But everybody was shaven, a group of men standing on the balcony with shaven heads, with the so-called Lausenpromenade, which means lice promenade, a shaved strip of hair, of skin rather, completely shaved. And they were waving to us and crying and laughing. First, they thought that we are in a terrible shape because we wore those rags, first of all, in which they never saw us before. And before we left Birkenau, they painted us with paint, like red, yellow, whatever, in order so we would not escape during our journey. And I saw among those men my husband. And of course, my happiness had no limits. And then, but downstairs, we saw a group of SS men, but in the middle of them, Mr. Schindler, with his little Tyrolean hat, with a little feather, and completely ignoring the Lagerführer, that means the head of our camp, and all the SS men and women. He said, I greet you, don't worry, now you're going to be well taken care of, there is hot soup waiting for you, and don't worry, you are with me now. So then we proceeded to go to the big halls of the factory itself. And of course, there was hot soup, and a pretty good hot soup. And we somehow, subconsciously, we are not afraid anymore. Our living quarters were not ready yet. There were no bunks. Everybody slept on straw, but nothing mattered anymore, because we knew that he will do everything. It was not absolutely sure, but we believed that he will do everything in his power to help us survive the war.
Okay. Tell me, tell me about some of the things that Schindler did for you, like getting fabrics at the end and maybe getting even weapons.
Yes. From the beginning, Schindler tried to do everything possible for us to make our life more comfortable. We didn't have very many clothes. I mean, we didn't have any clothes, only what we had on. He managed, I think he allowed our men to steal some wool from a neighboring factory, which was kind of already empty. They were not working anymore. Probably people left it. And so our men got that wool, and they made also on the machines and the factory knitting needles, and the women started to knit sweaters and little mufflers and so on, So then men wanted to smoke. I don't know how, but they got hold of some next door also from some onions, and they were really smoking the onion leaves, skins. Schindler, as far as food is concerned, all the surrounding areas were being slowly evacuated. So it was very difficult even for the Germans to get the food. But somehow he got food. We were not, we were always hungry, but not like in Auschwitz, We were hungry, but with hope for a better tomorrow. He tried to always give us a little piece of bread. I had a bunkmate who was really a master in cutting the pieces of bread. She cut it, I believe, in 13 very thin slices. The piece was like this. So I used to give my husband about 8, and I ate 5, because for me it was enough. He was bigger than I was. And then when the surrounding areas were getting evacuated, the factories were empty, he took a few men with him in a truck, and they went to a neighboring town and got some fabrics from an empty factory, which he put in our warehouse, in our camp, and told the men who were in charge of the warehouse, when the war is over, remember to distribute these fabrics evenly, so the people will have something to start their lives with. They can sell it, they can barter it, they can do something for themselves, some clothes, but let's wait till the end of the war. Then also, without the majority of us knowing until the very end, he acquired some guns, a big, again, my husband can give because he knew more about guns than I, a big, I think it was a machine gun and some handguns and some other arms, so we would be prepared if the Germans would try to kill us at the very end of the war, because this is what they tried to do. We had a Lager Führer, the head of our camp. His name was Leopold, and he was already started, gave orders to dig trenches for us, you know, to be put and shot in case of the Russians approaching closer. And somehow Schindler realized what's happening and asked Moshe Beisky. Moshe Beisky today is the Supreme Court Justice in Israel. And at the time, he was a young man, very good in forging documents. You know, he was kind of an artist, you know, he knew how to forge documents. And he forged a telegram to Leopold telling him to go, calling him to the front, which Leopold very reluctantly did, but we got rid of Leopold. And we had another man who became the head of our camp, but he was a lower rank than Leopold, and he was not too bad, because the Germans at that time realized the end of the war was near, and they knew they will have to account for their deeds. So that one was not too bad, but Leopold disappeared. And we had the guns. When Schindler wanted us to be prepared if the German either try to kill us or retreating Germans would try to overpower us and also kill us, he wanted us to be prepared.
Tell me about his birthday on April 28th.
On April 28th, because May 8th was the end of the war, the Liberation Day. But April 28th was his birthday, and we wanted to do something for him for his birthday. So each one of us, of the prisoners, gave a little portion of our bread and a little portion of our terrible jam or marmalade, whatever it was, and margarine. And someone who must have been very, very handy among us, I don't know who it was, made him a birthday cake. I mean, they didn't bake it, but just made it out of the bread and this. And we all gathered in the big hall, and Schindler spoke to us. He told us, and again, all the camp staff was there, all the women SS and the men SS and the head, the commandant, the commandant of the camp, the new one. Everybody was there, but he was absolutely not afraid of them, and he told us the end of the war is near. Please, think good thoughts, because you will survive the war. But as you survive the war, try to be human beings. And that's how he, you know,
Wait a
yeah.
minute, we have to reload. Let's back up, talk a little bit about the speech, and then tell me about the present that you gave to Schindler on that birthday, that all of you gave.
About the ring, right? Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. We also gave Schindler on his birthday, we gave him a present. One of our prisoners had some a tooth or two extracted. You know, we had a couple of doctors in our among us, and more than two, I think, and a dentist. And he donated the gold from his tooth to make a ring for Schindler, and on it there was an inscription: "He who saved." Now, let me see. I don't want to make a mistake. He who saved a Jew, I think.
One Jewish soul.
One Jewish soul saved the world.
Okay, tell me that story again. Tell me about the ring. Just tell me that he gave you a speech.
He gave us a speech, and also we gave him. Do you want me to talk about the speech itself?
Yeah. Tell me.
Well, he told us that he assured us that we will be liberated. He assured us that we will survive the war. And as we survive the war, he asked us to be human beings, to behave like human beings. You know, he probably wanted to avoid, you know, the actions of people who were desperate and so long in the prison and so on. So he asked us to behave like human beings, which we always remembered anyway. And and also one of our people donated gold from his extracted tooth to a jeweler who was in our camp, and he made a ring for Schindler, which bore the inscription: "He who saves a Jewish soul saves the whole world," which is an old Talmudic, I think, saying.
You one time said that you thought Schindler was trying to save a cross-section of Jewish...
Absolutely. He called it his Noah's Ark. Among us, there were doctors, there were teachers, there were locksmiths, there were carpenters, there were tailors, kind of a cross-section, men, women, and also children. We had a few children. Unfortunately, some fathers, when they left Plasźow, a few fathers who were on Schindler's list were able to get their boys also on the list. And they came to Brünnlitz. But the lager commandant, Leopold, whom I mentioned before, gave the order for those children to go back, to be sent to Auschwitz. Of course, the fathers refused for the children to go alone, and they all went with them.
What was Schindler risking to do? What did he do, and what did he risk?
Well, first of all, he risked his life, because under the Germans, helping a Jew, not saving him, but giving him bread or whatever, endangered his life and also the life of his family. He was arrested a few times by Gestapo, one time for, I think, some black market dealings, which he had to do in order to feed his people. And one time, I think, for they discovered some kind of a sabotage in his production, something like that. But every time he got out. That was not in Brünnlitz. This was still when we were in Plasźow, in Poland.
Were you like a family to him?
I think he did not come to Krakow with preconceived notions about it. You know, it somehow developed. He formed very close relationships with his workers. He realized he liked them, he respected them, and he, as the time progressed and he realized what the Germans were doing, that it was a final solution process, that that his people will be killed sooner or later, he decided he has to take some action and do something to prevent that.
How many people do you think he saved in all, in rough numbers? And also talk to me about whether or not you feel he was a hero.
He saved about 1,300 people, men and women. And then there were a few children who were a little older than the little boys who were sent back to Auschwitz. They were maybe teenagers. He saved those two. But in the total amount, I think more or less was 1,300 people. And definitely, I think he was a hero. He was, Yad Vashem recognized him as a righteous Gentile. And he was one of the few, the very first righteous Gentiles whom they gave the medal of Yad Vashem and allowed him to plant a tree in the alley of the righteous Gentiles in Jerusalem. And I think very few Germans. There are many Poles over there, the righteous Gentiles who helped the people. There are many, I think, Czech people, Swedish people, and so on, Danish people, French people, but no Germans. Germans are very, very few. And Schindler was one of the first ones to be recognized like this by Yad Vashem.
Talk about how you feel about how few people like him there were.
Well, that's why I feel that the testimony about Schindler should not be understood as whitewashing of the rest of German people, because German people as a whole are responsible. There were very few like Oskar Schindler. If I want to be very generous, I will say like 10 maybe, you know, on the whole. Maybe they helped a single person, some of them, very rarely, but to endanger your life and save 1,300 people, feeding them, fighting for their needs. We were talking about glasses before. Some people didn't have glasses. He went to some town, neighboring town, and got them glasses. So he was really very unusual, and the Germans, on the whole, were perpetrators of the most tragic murder of the history of humankind. And there was no precedent in history of something like this on a scale like that. This was premeditated. This was done accordingly to a plan, step by step.
Talk about resistance by being good human beings. This is in various experiences. You told an incident about an egg. You talked about sharing in camps and things like. Talk to me about how you feel about.
Yeah, I came to the conclusion that we were actually very good human beings. I'm talking about people that I knew, and in Plasźow and in Schindler's camp. We were helping one another. We were sharing. We were trying to be supportive. If somebody lost one of their close ones, we were very supportive. We try to really, because we could have, under the treatment that we received, we could have very easily have become animals. It was very easy to become like this. But we were really very supportive. I remember one time in Birkenau, every morning and every night, we had to stay not on the upper Platz, but in front of our barracks, in the bitter cold and a bitter, and lined in fives. And the SS women were going by, and if somebody looked a little pale or a little didn't stand very straight or something, they pulled them out and put them to a barrack which was designated to be sent to death in a very near future. So we tried to help. And I remember one time we were standing like this, early hours of the morning, maybe 4 o'clock, and we were standing, and I could feel that my knees were bending, you know, and I would fall anytime my back was hurting. I don't know what happened to me all of a sudden. So the girl in front of me and the girl in the back of me kind of supported me, you know. And in little things like this, we tried to, I shared my toothbrush. When I came to Brünnlitz, my husband had a present for me, several presents. He had a little...
Mrs. Page, I want you to tell me again about roll call and your legs getting weak, and I want you to say, I was on roll call in Birkenau, it was cold. Okay.
Okay. During one of the roll calls in Birkenau, we always had to stand on roll call early in the morning and in the evening. And I was standing, weather was freezing, November in Poland, and we were standing by fives, and I had a feeling that something is wrong with me. My legs started to, my knees bent under me, my back started to hurt terribly, and I felt I will fall. And falling down meant being taken out of the group and put in a separate barrack, supposedly unfit for work or unfit to live or whatever. So two of my friends, one who was standing in front of me, one who was standing in the back of me, were supporting me. Somehow, sometimes we had to rouge our cheeks. We took the beads from our soup and we rouged the cheeks a little bit, not to look very pale. We really helped one another in little ways, trying to be human beings, not getting angry, even though everybody was very nervous at the edge of their rope, so to say. And I remember in Brünnlitz, my husband prepared some gifts for me. He gave me a toothbrush, which was made, I think, from horse's hair or something like this. And that toothbrush I shared with my bunkmate because, of course, we had no toothbrush. Later in Schindler's camp, we had some kind of a soap, which was like, not soap, like a soda. You know what I mean? This is what powder. And of course cold water, but we didn't have lice because we were deloused when we came. Not right away, but later, because the lousing chamber was built after we came.
How do you see goodness of humanity being resistance?
I'm sorry.
How do you see that goodness being a form of resistance? You talked about.
Well, we unfortunately had no opportunity to resist in any other way, because what happened to us, first of all, was unprecedented in history. We were very gradually, the Germans did it gradually, like in my city, they took away, our right walking on the streets. Then the children could not go to school, the doctors could not practice, and so on, slowly. And we hoped, everybody said the war will be over in 2-3 months, We believed in that wholeheartedly. And then slowly they tightened the screws and deported to one place, deported to the next. This was absolutely a plan, very designed for annihilation of people, of the whole people. So any means of trying to survive even being good to one another, especially being good to one another, meant some form of resistance. Not giving up. It was very easy to give up. You know, many people did.
You told something about a child who saved a potato for his father. Can you tell me that?
Yes, this was, that happened when we were leaving Birkenau. As I told you, our train was standing on some side station. And all of a sudden, a very dear friend of mine who lives now in New York heard a whistle, familiar whistle, which she realized was her husband. And she thought, my God, what is, and it came from a direction of the camp. There was a fence near that side station, and on the other side of this, that fence, there was a group of people standing in striped uniforms. And she realized that one of them was her husband. She couldn't understand what happened. He's supposed to be in Brünnlitz. How come he's not in Brünnlitz? He's in Birkenau. And they started, she asked for permission to step down the train just in front of it, and they started to shout to one another. And she found out that Leopold made her husband, he didn't want children, so her husband and her little boy, who at the time, when the war was over, he was about 13, so he could have been maybe 8, no, this was 1944, maybe 12, maybe 11, something like that. So her little boy and her husband came to Birkenau, and somehow they found out, you know, through the grapevine in camp, the grapevine goes all the time, they found out that the transport of women is leaving, and they went to that particular point, and they realized that that transport of women were the familiar woman. You know, he realized that's his wife. So they started to talk to one another, shout rather, and her little boy said, Mommy.
Wait, let's cut. This motor is too much. Okay. So they're yelling through the fence.
They're yelling through the fence, and the little boy, his name is Alexander, Oleg, diminutive, says, Mommy, I am taking care of Daddy. I saved a potato for him, you know. And there was another lady who was the mother, apropos, of the little boy that my husband told you about, Richard Horowitz, the photographer. And she saw her little boy with his father over there when she expected them to be in Brünnlitz. Of course, these women were terribly, terribly devastated, you know. They thought they would be reunited with the family, and it didn't happen so. So that little boy, who later was liberated in Auschwitz, was Richard Horowitz. He was also on the other side of the fence. They were cousins, Al Rosner and Richard Horowitz. They are cousins.
Okay. Is that noise all right? Yeah, it's all right. I want you to tell me again, I'm sorry to ask you to do this again, but I want you to tell me again the Germans coming and knocking on the door to take your mother away, because there was so much noise before.
Okay, all right.
And tell it as though you haven't told me before.
Okay. In November 1939, Poland, of course, was under German occupation. And we had some restrictions in the city. We had to wear the yellow armbands. We couldn't go walk on certain streets and so on. But we still lived in the city, not in the ghetto, in our pre-war apartment. And one night in the early November, my mother went downstairs to attend to a sick patient in the same building. And I heard a strong knock on the door. When I opened the door, I saw 3 Germans, one in a green uniform of the SS, I think it must have been SS, and 2 black uniforms of local Germans, who already were part of the German army and who before the war were traitors.
Let's just stop.
Oh.
Playing. Okay, let's just pick it up there.
I opened the door, and I saw those 3 Germans, one in the green uniform of the German SS, and the other one, the 2 other ones in black uniforms of the so-called Volksdeutschen, which were the local Germans who sympathized with Hitler before the war, and they were traitors to Poland. And when Germans occupied Poland, they all joined the German army or whatever unit they wanted. And the German in the green uniform said, "You are arrested on political grounds. Put together a few warm clothes and all the valuables, your jewelry, your money, put on the table." And as my mother, in the meantime,
So what did he say?
he said, "You are arrested on political grounds." In the meantime, my mother came upstairs running. Somebody notified her that the Germans are on the apartment, which was bad by itself, without knowing what's going to happen. And he said, "You are arrested on political grounds. Put together some warm things and put all your jewelry and all the valuables on the table. Otherwise, that will be a death penalty, you will be shot." And he also told my mother that I was not on the list if I want to stay. So I remember now, it dawned on me that my mother asked, "Can I stay in the apartment?" He said, "No, the apartment will be sealed." Anyway, I preferred to go with my mother. I didn't want to part with her. And as we were putting our things together, my mother had her jewelry put in a little sack, which she carried because those were very dangerous, and one never knew what the next minute will bring. So she carried that with her, and she handed it to me, and she said, "Throw it in the toilet and flush the water." So I did. Then they took us out. They sealed the apartment, and we went to a building which used to be my high school before the war, from which I graduated. And there, to my great astonishment, I realized there were many, many people, many of whom I knew, some of my teachers, some of my friends.
We have to stop. Let's put one more roll on.
Okay. After they took us to a building which was my pre-war high school building, and as we walked to the big, tremendous gym hall, I realized that I see many, many people there, because there was no precedent before as far as in deportations. We didn't know about it. This was the first one that we heard, accordingly to the list, especially by names. And I realized there were many people that I knew. There were doctors, there were my teachers and my friends. And afterwards, we found out this was a transport of about 1,000 people. It was a selected group, Polish Catholics and Polish Jews, selected probably the elite of the city, because the Germans always did that. They considered the intelligentsia the leaders of the eventual resistance, and they tried to prevent that. So they transported, they divided the transport. One transport went to Częstochowa, and the other one went to Kraków. I was taken to Kraków with my mother.
Let's cut. And
also my husband, because that happened when in his barrack,
13.
You know, in Plasźow, when the Germans came in and during the prayers or something.
Tell me about what you know.
Yeah, but I don't know that much about it, no.
Well, tell me about.
Yeah, I tell you.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay. First of all, I come from a very assimilated family. And before the war, I never, had an occasion to meet very religious Jews. And I remember, never forget, when we were leaving our barrack in Birkenau, and two of my, we were always kept in fives, you know, and two of my friends were twins. They didn't look alike at all. They were from a small town near Krakow. And I remember when we were leaving the barrack, one of them started to pray, you know, Shema Yisrael. At that time, I didn't even know what it meant, you know. God is great, you know, and so on. They were very religious all the time. They always prayed. And there were many Jews who, in those circumstances, kept their prayers and tried, for instance, during Yom Kippur, many of them wouldn't eat, as hungry as they were, you see, because you're supposed to fast that day. So that was, many people showed a tremendous moral strength in face of what was happening all around them.
Was it punishable, praying?
Oh yes, that was not allowed, absolutely. This had to be done in the clandestine way. That means that the Germans should not know. Always somebody stood outside and watched, you know, if they are approaching.
Now we should maybe get quiet room tone or room tone with sheet metal.